Welcome once again to all of the viewers that are joining us from across the Greater South, and I dare say from across the world. Some of you at more godly hours than others, and for those that are awake particularly early, and those particularly late to join us, all of our gratitude. So welcome again to this, as we have decided to term it, third episode of The Third Way, live with the Secretary General, with the SG. And of course, as I promised last week, despite a few travels that were planned, we managed to make sure that we would continue with this regular program every week, out of profound conviction, once again, in the importance that is your voice. Your voice, not only in terms of questions and answers with regards to the organization of Southern cooperation and what we are doing, but your voice in terms of views, in terms of criticisms, suggestions, proposals that you have in the collective construction of a third way of development from the Greater South, by the Greater South, yet for the entirety of humanity. But before we get started, I would like to acknowledge the team members that are here, despite the fact that this is a Sunday, and I am sure many of them have usually more interesting things to do than to listen to me, as they have to do that throughout the week. However, to acknowledge Abdurrahim al-Idrisi, who is, of course, a member of our PACE team, that is our team for public advocacy, communications and engagement, dedicated to communicating our efforts and our views from the South of technological development, of our need as countries to become drivers of this technological revolution. And today, of course, just as last time, he is here to make sure that everything goes well technically. And next to him, we have Betty Solomon. Betty Solomon, as I've said last time, but we have a saying in Arabic that comes from the Prophet, which is إِنَّ الذِّكْرَ تَنْفَعِ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ, that is, reminders also benefit those who already believe. And therefore, Betty Solomon, that is my assistant technically, but as I've said before, and I ratify, is more of my brain. She is the one that actually leads the operations. I only do the talking, and I abide and obey to the orders that she gives. And there, of course, we have Hidayat Chalkoparan, my chief of staff, that continues to mistreat me in terms of my scheduling and travels, but that does it with the best of intentions, that is, with a consciousness that when you are in an organization like the OSC, it is not a job. It is a cause. And what I often say is that with causes, you either invest yourself at 100% or you stop pretending. And therefore he mistreats me, but with a consciousness of the need for us to invest ourselves at 100% for this vision that goes beyond the secretariat of the organization and that transcend every single one of us. And of course, my dear Dr. Getahun Garadu, my special advisor for environmental policy and climate action, a theme that is central to our endeavors, and as we discussed during our last episode, that justifies from an objective perspective the need for a third way of development, and a man, of course, that is unequaled when it comes to commitment and investment of oneself into delivering, not for oneself, not for KPIs, but out of a firm conviction. And of course, Annabelle, who is a member of the PACE team and communicates, ensures, and you will have seen some of her work, of communicating our endeavors in terms of balanced and inclusive education that is transforming our education systems so that they may be more responsive not only to 21st century imperatives, but more capable of answering the aspirations of our peoples based upon national priorities and our visions as countries. So truly, a foundation block for everything that we must build. And of course, Annabelle, extraordinary writer, and one that I must acknowledge because I didn't do this because we got very busy this week, but to thank you for the very kind token, that a beautiful, beautiful token that she brought. So the token, what is, I know it was a sort of blanket, but where is it from?
It's from the Maasai community.
From the Maasai?
Yes, the Maasai community.
From the Maasai community. A beautiful, beautiful blanket accompanied by a beautiful letter, and I'm ever so grateful to you, Annabelle. Thank you. And of course, and that was because you were in Kenya. Yes. Because of course, Annabelle is from Kenya, and she brought this token. And of course, Mrs. Pearl, also part of the peace team, and the one that ensures that things keep moving, that we do not stop, we do not pause, we continue moving forward. And that is the spirit of the OSCE that she embodies perfectly, and also the one that brings order to these sessions by keeping me on my toes when it comes to time. So, of course, Pearl, and of course, the extraordinary Kulsi, as last time I've said, extraordinary artist, extraordinary writer, poet, performer, but most importantly, most crucially, extraordinary human being, whose greatness is found in his humility, and of course who acts tongue-in-cheek as the executive producer of this program. And of course Rufi, who has joined us from the Philippines and focuses his endeavors regarding work from our work in transdisciplinary research, that we may have research that better responds to our contexts, but that also enables our countries to have a scientific production capacity that ensures that we are better able to respond to the development needs of our people. Rufi, of course, extraordinary trajectory as a journalist, and one who is very quiet, but that is his perhaps strength, the power of listening. And therefore, Rufi is with us. Of course, on the other room, we have some team members, including Fabian from Chile, who will be dealing with the WhatsApp calls that we hope to receive this time around. Having made the presentations of the team here, and thanking all of you once more for joining us virtually, my intention this time around is genuinely to be as concise as possible. Concise as possible to give greater space for your questions, your comments, your suggestions, criticisms that I will seek within the time frames that we have to answer fully, comprehensively, and without filters. Now, of course, before, however, opening the floor, I wanted to raise some general, very brief thoughts. And first, because I think that even though this program is designed to speak about more than the Secretariat's activities, more than what we do from the OSCE, but genuinely contribute to an exchange and dialogue more directly than I can usually with every single one of you, that leads us to the collective definition and construction of this third way of development. However, I think it would be good practice that every time I just bring a quick and brief update on the work that we've done. And since our last engagement, last week, I have, as Secretary General, thankfully, been able to find footing at our headquarters without any travels or missions. But this past week has been of intense activity, not just for myself, but for the entirety of the Secretariat. As you may all know, our General Assembly, the next ordinary session of our General Assembly, will be held at the end of November. And here, from the organization, the entirety of the Secretariat is mobilized to articulate, well, first, to review everything that we have done in the past 2 years, our successes, our shortcomings, and how to get better. But also in preparing for the next General Assembly, the draft or proposed program and strategic direction of the organization over the upcoming 2 years. And of course, this, as you can understand, is of intense activity that is required from it. But of course, this is why also today's exchange takes on another dimension, and that is hearing your views, your proposals, your recommendations. It will, hopefully, positively impact the drafting work that we are undertaking and that will be proposed to our member states for final approval in November. And of course, beyond that, I think we are Sunday 22nd of September. And yesterday, as some of you may know, was the International Day of Peace. And this International Day of Peace, I suppose, more than most, and at the risk of not having as joyous a note as I would like, is then one that takes profound meaning. Because international days are not days of celebration. We can celebrate, but their profound meaning, their raison d'être, is fundamentally to ensure that we take stock of our shortcomings, so that we are better able to articulate a future that genuinely responds to the aspiration of a given international day. And in this case, of course, the International Day of Peace has taken place when, across the world, we are seeing, unfortunately, a multiplication of armed conflicts. A multiplication of armed conflicts that ultimately, whose price is ultimately paid by the most innocent amongst us, by those who are least to blame, by the innocent, by women and children, by the teacher at school that is only going to do their work. And of course, in this International Day of Peace, I couldn't help myself but to think about what is, and I know that what I will say will not necessarily please everyone, but I couldn't help but think of the horrendous situation that is still ongoing in Palestine, a founding member state of the Organization of Southern Cooperation, in Gaza, and see with dismay that we are fast approaching 1 year from the start of those bombardments. And the issue of Gaza today is no longer, in my view, an issue of politics. It is not about whether you are pro-Israel, pro-Palestine, or, hopefully, pro-peace. But it is a fundamental human question. And the more this conflict drags on, not only do we see more people die needlessly, not only do we see children who are not only suffering, who will not only grow up with trauma, but also in terms of schooling, since we were speaking of balanced and inclusive education, who will find it extremely difficult to catch up on what has been lost. And the repercussions of this are always felt years after these tragedies. And of course, the more this drags on as well, the more we forget about it. The less we think about it. The less we mobilize against it. And we cannot allow ourselves that complacency. In a recent interview, which I think is going to air fully this evening, when I was in Cameroon, I was asked by the interviewer what it was that I considered to be the values that guided my life and that could have an impact on my leadership or the way that the organization is directing itself. And my response, which I ratified today, was three values, three things, if you will, that have and continue to, and I hope will always continue to direct my action. And I think directs the action of everyone within this Secretariat. The team members that are here, but the over 100 that are within this Secretariat. The first, and again at the risk of sounding fluffy, the first is profound sentiments of love. Love for humanity, with all its depravity but also all of its elevation. And love that leads you inevitably to the second aspect, which is righteous anger. Righteous anger at injustice. Righteous anger at opportunities that are prohibited to certain people because they are born in the wrong place at the wrong time. Conjugated with a profound conviction that there is no providential human being, there is no single human being that saves humanity. That saves humanity. No. A profound conviction that when we come together as collectives, we can make the world a better place. And I mention this in the context of Gaza and the International Day of Peace, because we cannot allow our submersion by information, the course of human affairs, make us forget that this is undergoing. That we are facing a situation where, according to estimates, over 2% of Gaza's population has been killed. And I understand that some like to argue about numbers no matter what the source is. And fair enough. Let us say it is not 2%. Let's say it is 1%. Or 0.5%. It does not make it any better. And this requires us, on such an international day, to come together as an international community, if it does exist, to take firm action to ensure that the bloodshed of innocence is stopped. But also, thinking of the International Day of Peace, and from this context, peace in and of itself is never, I would argue, at the risk of sounding provocative, peace in and of itself is not a virtue. I say peace is not a virtue because, since we were mentioning Gaza, in the Middle East, a region, as you can assume, close to my heart, and to steal the title of the book by David Fromkin, there was an excellent book on the topic. We were given, between 1914 and 1922, a peace to end all peace. that is a peace that is unfair, a peace that is unjust, a peace whose foundations generate discrimination, is no longer peace. It is nothing more and nothing less than perhaps welcome pacification. And our endeavors collectively, in the knowledge that it will not be easy, from education, from technology, from the economy, from multilateralism, from wherever we are, is to contribute to justice, of which peace is the sustainable fruit. And therefore, on this past International Day of Peace, and today, we should simultaneously be calling for justice and fairness. But of course, justice takes time to be forged. And for justice to be forged, we need a vision. And therefore, before opening the floor, I must take note, positively, of the fact that today, early in the morning in New York, and tomorrow, will be the Summit of the Future, convened by the Secretary General of the United Nations, and that will see the adoption of a pact for the future. An aspect, of course, that must be commended and must be saluted. We cannot move forward as the world without a vision of the future, without knowing what it is that we want to build as a future. And of course, I took the liberty of perusing that I have here, in fact, I did this earlier this morning, the draft of the Pact of the Future, that at least the draft that I have, which I think is the latest one, it might have been slightly revised, but of the 13th of September, which is the fourth revision of the Pact of the Future. A document whose spirit must be commended, must be saluted. But looking at some of those articulations, I also recognize the difficult task that was that of the co-facilitators of the process to build consensus on this document. And because I know from experience that multilateral consensus is always extremely challenging. And this reminded me of the importance of, yes, having some such global goals. And this reminded me of the importance of, yes, having some such of having global goals. But the more global we go in the articulation of our goals, the more generalized the goals become. And whereas we salute and we look forward to the formal adoption of this Pact of the Future, we must also keep in mind the need of articulating more contextual goals, more contextual objectives, in addition, as a complement to this Pact of the Future. In particular, I could not help but notice some crucial points being raised within this draft. Of course, there is, if it is still articulated this way, the Action 5, which legitimately sought to call, under its paragraph A, for more promote export-led growth for developing countries. And whereas we welcome this aspiration, from the South we must also, in addition to this objective or action item, articulate or qualify that export-led growth. And our position, at least from the OSCE, articulated by our member states, is also to ensure that those exports are also high value added exports. That we do not remain as countries exporters of raw or intermediary materials and resources, but also produce the high value addition and high value added products that will not only ensure that our exports, the returns from those exports, are more equitable, but also ensure that our national consumption relies less on imports. For those of you that are joining for the first time, I often mention coffee that we have here. Coffee that symbolizes countries of the South because it is a tree, once again, whose fruit is universal, yet whose roots only grow in Latin America and the Caribbean, in Africa, in the Arab world, in Asia. And yet, when you look at the top 10 coffee exporters, 4 are in a region of the world that does not have a single coffee tree. And whereas coffee exporters in the South that continue to export green beans make on average $2.5 the bag, exporters from the North that process coffee ensure that, well, they sell it on average at $40 the bag. And therefore, if we want a fairer, more just future, we must also address this need, not only for greater exports from our countries and reduced tariffs for trade. We must also ensure that we have the support needed to have high value added industrialization. I also could see the rightful call of appreciation and acceleration of the reallocation of up to $100 billion of special drawing rights to developing countries. For those that may or may not remember, during COVID-19 in 2021, the IMF issued over $600 billion worth of special drawing rights to support countries in their efforts of economic recovery after the exogenous shock of the pandemic. Yet we recall also that out of the $600 billion, only 7% went to the continent of Africa, which was not even enough to help the governments of this continent to cover the extra budgetary expenditures related to mitigating COVID. That Latin America and the Caribbean received only approximately 8%, and that the majority went to those who needed it the least, which was countries in the north. And whereas we acknowledge and we appreciate those efforts to reallocate up to $100 billion worth of special drawing rights to our countries, we also believe from the Organization of Southern Cooperation that in addition to those measures that are welcome, that are necessary, that are commendable, we must also work towards achieving a structural transformation of the systems that generate those problems. And of course, this goes to what the Pact mentions, of accelerating the reform, and I would argue the transformation, of the international financial architecture, but also articulating within our countries new additional institutions, in parallel, in complement, not in contradiction, that enable our countries to access not only fresh finance that is direly needed, but also, and most crucially, to have a stronger voice in those matters that affect what is ultimately the majority of the world. And it is for this reason that in addition to the Pact of the Future that we welcome and we look forward to seeing its formal adoption hopefully later today in New York, we are convening from the OSCE the Congress of the Greater South. A transcendental process that has been mandated by our General Assembly and that has already started. And here when I say Congress of the Greater South, do not misunderstand Congress in an academic sense, but rather here Congress takes almost a legislative sense, a political dimension in the best possible meaning of the term, that is a project for the world. And this Congress of the Greater South is being convened through a number of consultations, two of which have already happened, across our countries, where we are inviting not only our governments that are of course being consulted, but also, and crucially, civil society organizations, indigenous peoples organizations, our universities, our scientists, our artists, so that our youth as well, through a number of student unions, not only to hear views, but to articulate through every single one of those consultations a consolidated set of recommendations that will be presented at the summit of the Greater South, so that we may, at the conclusion of this process, adopt collectively a common roadmap and plan of action for the construction of a third way of development from the South, but again for the entirety of humanity. And in this regard, these sessions constitute for us as well an opportunity to collect your views for the construction of this third way. And therefore I promise to be short and concise. I have failed, but I want to give the floor, open the floor for the questions, the comments, criticisms, telephone calls as well through WhatsApp. I'm getting the computer in order to review and to receive your comments. Let us have a look. So I see a question from Southern Voice on YouTube that says, I have two questions, and hopefully I will have two answers. The first is, can you please elaborate a bit more on the concept of Greater South? Is it a geographical region? If so, where do its boundaries begin and end? This is a crucial question, and I very much thank Southern Voice for this question. And I think I had addressed it in the last episode, but I will be very glad to reiterate. The reason that we from the OSC utilize the term Greater South instead of Global South, and the reason that we do so is, let us start perhaps by defining our starting point. And the starting point is the language that we use, the vocabulary that we use, inevitably shapes the way we see the world. And I recorded, which if you haven't seen it, I think it is available on YouTube. I highly advise it. A recorded dialogue between Michel Foucault and Noam Chomsky, in which, after their dialogue, at one point, and I'm paraphrasing of course, Foucault in French, but I will quote it in English, looks towards Chomsky and the moderator and says, whereas I admire and I commend Mr. Chomsky's determination and conviction in the importance of building a better world, building a more egalitarian society, it appears to me, he argued, that we must first identify the centers of power, i.e. unjust power, within our current societies and criticize them. Because if we do not do so, we risk replicating those power dynamics in a new form in the societies of the future. Because, he says, and I'm paraphrasing, when people think of power, we usually think of the army, of the police, of what Foucault called the repressive apparatus of the state. But power, potent power, is also found in our universities, in our schools, in our cultural spheres, in society. And therefore we must first identify them, then criticize them. And of course, the reason that I mention this is that when you hear the term global south, I would argue it seems to hide a certain perception of the world that can't quite be identified. And if it can't be identified, then it can't be criticized. And if it can't be criticized, then it can't be transformed or rectified. And this hidden aspect that I would see in global south is that it hides two dimensions. On the one hand, you have the term global that seems to imply that we are interconnected, that we are globalized. Whereas one of the challenges that faces our countries is precisely the lack of interconnectedness. A lack of interconnectedness within our countries. A lack of interconnectedness with the rest of the world, given, for example, the techno-digital divide that we seek to answer from the OSCE, or overcome from the OSCE. But the second, of course, is the South, which seems to give the impression of a geographic, as you rightfully point out, southern voice, that seems to point out a geographic region. Yet Australia, New Zealand are geographically in the south, yet nobody considers them to be part of the global south. Mexico, Cuba, Morocco, Tunisia are part, geographically, of the northern hemisphere, yet nobody considers them to be part of the global north. And therefore, once again, it is a term that is, in our view, misleading. And if it is misleading, it misleads our reading of the world. And if it misleads our reading of the world, it also misleads our actions within it, to transform it. Now, we have heard, or I have heard, of alternatives. I've heard developing world, or developing countries. And again, I have a problem fundamentally with that terminology, because it depends what you mean by development. Because when you are speaking of developing countries and developed countries, the assumption is that developing countries will one day, or should one day, reach the same state, so to speak, as the so-called developed countries. But we know, once again, from purely objective perspectives, that because of the climate crisis that the world is undergoing, those models of development within the so-called developed countries are not sustainable. That is, if I had a magic wand that I could wave and to make sure that every single human being overnight would live like the average American, US American, or the average Frenchman, the world would immediately come to an end. Again, not for moral reasons, purely in terms of the models of consumerism and development that have been adopted in those countries. And therefore, developing I do not find it a useful term unless we agree on a common definition of development that goes through a transformation of our paradigms, which is what we are trying to do through the third way of development as a collective. Then I've heard other less common alternatives, majority world. One author that I know wrote a very interesting book about education, Abdel Jalil Akkari, where he wrote, I think his title of the book was educational practices from the majority world. And of course, majority world has one virtue, which is it showcases or demonstrates or reminds us, what is often forgotten, that our countries that are currently being called of the global south are countries that constitute the majority of the world and also have a minority voice in the world. But beyond that reminder, I do not find within the term a useful reading of the world. Because again, what's the virtue or the vice contained within a majority? To be in a majority, you could be also on a completely wrong path. It is only a description of affairs. One term that I have liked, and this will surprise you, and surprise most of you, I suppose, is third world. And I know it is a term that has fallen out of favor. That, and unfairly I think, has a very negative connotation in our collective imaginary. But, you know, third world, in my view, does not mean that there is a first world, a second world, and we rank third. No. A third world only implies that from countries of this third world, by countries from this third world, we have a duty to build the third way. And to do so, also recognizing that the word world implies humanity, implies diversity, implies difference. But of course, one has always to choose one's battles. And again, because of that very negative connotation of the term in our collective imaginary, we did not think, and I do not think it worth it, to wage the battle of trying to reclaim third world as a positive term. And therefore we have come up with the term greater south. First, because on the one hand it builds upon a terminology that we are more or less familiar with. It evokes global south. But the question then is, why greater? And greater not because it is a better than. No, we use the term greater almost in its geographic sense, which is going beyond what we usually understand as a geographic area. And that greater south, therefore, is a south that includes not only our countries that are usually qualified today as countries of the global south, but also include, most crucially, the south of the north. Because the dynamics of injustice, the dynamics of dependency, are always the same, no matter the scale. And within the north there is a south. Indigenous peoples, immigrant communities, labor movements, civil rights movements, feminist movements. And we consider them also to be part of the South because we have to understand injustice from an intersectional, interconnected perspective. And of course, this also implies, when you say greater South, there is a South in the North, but there is also a North in the South. And there is a North in the South which tends to be, and we have to recognize this, which tends to be our capital cities, our large urban centers that centralize, usually, all activities. And just as there is unjust dynamics between North and South, there is unjust dynamics that are not too dissimilar from capital to province. And this is why we use Greater South, in order to recognize that our countries of those three continents share, well, first, are very diverse very different in many respects, but share some systemic challenges and aspirations that make it desirable for us to work together. But also that many of those challenges, many of those aspirations are also shared within certain movements, certain contexts in the North. And therefore, to be part of the Greater South is not only geographic, it is not only a question of nationality, it is to subscribe to a movement, a very diverse, decentralized movement of change. It is to subscribe to be a member of a club of the dissatisfied with the current state of affairs. And therefore, there are some thinkers that I would argue, even though in terms of nationality, are not from what is usually understood as the global South. In terms of thought, are part of the Greater South. I think of Angela Davis, for instance, who is most certainly a thinker of the Greater South. Of Edgar Morin in France, who is certainly a thinker of the Greater South. And therefore Greater South is a terminology that refers to our countries of the three continents and that are usually understood as countries of the global South, but also, and most crucially, goes beyond the arbitrariness of geography to include, so it is an inclusive term, all those who are ready to join efforts in a collective to achieve a better future, to build a third way of development. I hope that I have answered this question. I go on to the second question of Southern Voice. In the same connection, can you please share with us more information about the evolution of the process that has led to the creation of the OSC? How have these ideas of closer South-South cooperation and the third way of development been transformed from initial thoughts into concrete action? A very crucial question. The reason I am chuckling, Southern Voice, is I could spend a few days on this topic. But allow me to seek to be as concise as possible, but comprehensive nevertheless. The OSC itself, the Organization of Southern Cooperation, was born in January 2020 at an international summit whose principal objective, in fact, was the adoption, the proclamation of the Universal Declaration of Balanced and Inclusive Education, which you may find online as well on the OSC website. Now, you might say, well, why are we starting from the point of education? That is, how do you jump from the Universal Declaration of Balanced and Inclusive Education to the Organization of Southern Cooperation? And it emerged from the fact that our countries, because the summit was attended by countries from Latin America and the Caribbean, Africa, the Arab world, Asia Pacific, in the Republic of Djibouti, our countries of the South, our founding states of the OSC, recognized, of course, as we all do, the importance of education. But allow me to speak more transparently. This is starting to sound like a pre-prepared speech. And the point of those exchanges is to be transparent. Let us drop for a moment all those terminologies that create a false sense of community or consensus, but that mean absolutely nothing. To be in favor of education means absolutely nothing. Of course we agree. I have never heard anyone, anywhere, government or civil society say, no, I am against education, or I am against inclusion. These are terms that the question is not whether you're in favor of education or not. The question is, what kind of education? For what kind of future? And therefore, the reason that I mention this is that when our countries came together to proclaim the Universal Declaration of Balanced and Inclusive Education, they did so with a conviction in the importance of transforming our education systems through interculturalism, transdisciplinarity, dialecticism, and contextuality, more of which you can read in the declaration itself. Transforming our education systems, but understanding that to transform education for the sake of transforming education is a futile intellectual exercise. Education and its transformation only takes meaning, only becomes meaningful when it serves a vision of the future, of where do we want to be in 20 years. And therefore, when you speak of education, you have to speak of health. You have to speak of the economy. You have to speak of agriculture. You have to speak, crucially, of the financing that you need to transform your education system. So you have to speak of the international financial architecture. You have to speak of debt, and so on and so forth. And therefore they created the OEC at the time, now the Organization of Southern Cooperation, as a platform, an intergovernmental platform belonging to the member states, responding to the member states, accountable to the member states and through them, of course, to their peoples, to support and accompany our countries as much in the educational transformation to which we aspire, as well as, crucially, all those other sectors that must be addressed to shape the future that we want. And now you might ask, of course, why South-South cooperation? Why not just broader? And it goes back to what I was saying regarding the Pact of the Future, that again we commend, but that goes a bit also to the sense of the SDGs, which are of course welcome. But, you know, the question is, when we say that we want an education by 2030 to ensure an education that is equitable, inclusive for all, and quality for all, we agree. The question is, what does quality mean? What does equity mean? What does inclusiveness mean? And of course, there are, of course, the subset of goals and objectives that define it a bit, but countries of the South share, again, some systemic challenges that make it desirable and necessary for us to work together, because we share contexts, which also means we share experiences that we can share amongst ourselves. And that does not preclude or exclude North-South cooperation, not at all, but recognizing that we must work closer horizontally as well. Now, in saying all of this, one thing that I think is crucial to bring to light, because you asked how to move from the abstract to concrete action, and I think that is the spirit that led to the OSCE's creation, which is we have had, and we continue to have, crucial platforms and fora for South-South cooperation. The non-aligned movement, since 1961, a crucial platform, a precursor, in fact, of South-South cooperation. But as the name indicates, a movement with no permanent secretariat to execute the decisions of our countries. So a crucial forum for consultation amongst our heads of state every 3 years. That is important, but without the aspiration of project implementation. We have the G77 plus China, whose role and importance we have seen during the negotiations for the Pact of the Future. But precisely that, a coalition of countries from the South, with the purpose of negotiating mostly within the United Nations framework, a crucial function, an essential function, but one that doesn't have the aspiration of having a permanent secretary to implement projects. Then, of course, you have the South Center, which is, in terms of structure, a step above in that it has a treaty, and it does exist, as an intergovernmental institution, but one whose aspiration has always been from the onset the very crucial work of acting as a think tank for our countries, to provide them with the support in terms of policy briefs and studies and research in order to achieve their aspirations. But again, not with the aspiration of implementing South-South cooperation programs. And therefore the OSCE's creation as an intergovernmental institution with an executive secretariat, permanent executive secretariat, came out of this recognition that in addition to all those fora and platforms, we needed as countries to have an organization with a permanent executive secretariat capable of executing and implementing the decisions of the member states and a common program, so that South-South cooperation can move beyond just occasional bilateral agreements between our countries, can move beyond general frameworks and exclusively common negotiating positions, which is also important, towards concrete, palpable, tangible cooperation in projects that contribute to our development aspirations. And of course, over the past year and a half, since we have become fully executive, we have done an extraordinary, well, I say we, the team has done an extraordinary work in bringing forth, in executing tangibly, successfully, a number of programs for our member states in the common program of member states and associate members, amongst which, and I will not list everything, of course, but amongst which the Greater South Information System that democratizes access to knowledge for our universities, our student bodies, our faculty and researchers, that also visibilizes research made in our countries so that there might be greater collaboration across our countries. The Freire program, that is a multi-phased process that seeks to create student and academic staff mobility across our countries, not only for three reasons. First, to open up educational opportunities for our youth, to make education more relevant, and third, but not least, to build sustainable bridges between our peoples. Now, of course, these are some of the programs, but other programs are, of course, the Common Leveraging Union of Borrowers, the club, which was created by our member states to finally have, with a permanent team at disposal dedicated to this issue, to undertake, if the member states so decide, collective negotiations in terms of debt relief, but most importantly, to secure fresh, highly concessional finance, that is, low-cost finance, if not grant-based finance, for our development. And therefore, to answer your question, it has been quite a process. I haven't given you every step of the way that was ours. I'll be happy to do it if you ask me to. But the overall, this was the process and the rationale for the creation of the OSCE. And the mere fact of the existence of a permanent executive secretariat accountable to the member states and associate members is one that contributes fundamentally to moving South-South cooperation from an abstract idea to one that is very palpable with tangible projects. I hope I have answered your question. If I have not, please feel free to ask again. And if we have time, I will certainly do so. I see a question from Suno Kabira on YouTube. How do you see the role of balanced and inclusive education in ensuring peace of mind amongst future generations to answer all kinds of races for confrontational existence, going around in the world for peaceful coexistence? I think I understood the gist of your question, and without wanting to spend too much time on this, because Mrs. Pearl is looking at me, telling me that I'm taking too long per question, and at this rate we will not answer everything. But I would tell you that balanced and inclusive education is not an educational model. It is a framework with principles that are meant to be translated depending on context, national context, local context, the individuality of each student. And that means that when we speak of balanced and inclusive education, this framework, there must be an Ethiopian model of balanced and inclusive education, a Nicaraguan model of balanced and inclusive education, a Cambodian model of balanced and inclusive education, a Jordanian model of balanced and inclusive education, and so on and so forth. However, as a framework, a transformative framework for our education systems, BIE seeks to address the social and cultural drivers of exclusion. That is, the aspiration of balanced and inclusive education is not only to include more people in our education systems. So it's not just about the quantity of people you put in the system, when the system itself is generating exclusion. Our endeavor is to say, yes, we need more schools, yes, we need more teachers, but in parallel to that, what we need is to address the structural drivers, the socio-cultural drivers of exclusion, by addressing programs, by addressing pedagogies, by addressing governance models so that they become more holistic. But I know this can sound very abstract. And therefore, more concretely, BIE seeks to, first and foremost, through intraculturalism, first, have education systems that better reflect our cultures as peoples, who we are as peoples, in order to enable us to become who we want to be. And by this, what I mean is, when you look at the historical narrative within most education systems, they remain very Eurocentric, which means that most people, most young people in the Greater South go to school and they do not see themselves within the curriculum. They are being told by the curriculum that they do not exist. And that is therefore profoundly alienating. Similarly, of course, when I say culture, the same is true with gender. Just as many histories of the South have been erased from historical or narratives, so have women been erased. And therefore, in this regard, and therefore revisibilizing women within our curriculum. And I give an example often. If you ask most people, give me the name of one great scientist, most would say Marie Curie, and that is it. There is 100 men, only one woman. And therefore the wrong message that we are transmitting to our young girls is, the likelihood of you as a young lady becoming a scientist is very low. Yet, when you look at history, in the 9th century, the longest running university in the world was established in what is today Morocco, in Al-Qarawiyyin, by a woman called Fatima al-Fihri, that has not been visibilized within our historical narratives. So first, visibilizing our cultures. But because you were asking about a peaceful world, BIE and intraculturalism do not fall into the other extreme of creating a sort of ethno-nationalist, culturally protectionist narrative. No. It seeks to say, I need to look at my own culture, my own identity, my own history, see the contributions of my culture to the world, but also, most crucially, see the contributions of others to my own culture. So for instance, as an Arab, I know that my Arab culture today would not be what it is if it wasn't for the historical contribution culturally of the Greeks, of the Indians, of the Chinese. And therefore I know that my culture is already the result of a millenary process of diversity, of absorption. No culture is pure, but all cultures have contributed to our narratives, to our world. And of course, what I say at the more global level is equally applicable at the national level, where when you have countries that have multiple cultures, well, they have all contributed to what has become the national identity. And it is visibilizing that, showing through a revalorization of history, of our histories, showing the mutual dependence, interdependence between our countries, what I call healthy cultural pride. Cultural pride because you know what your culture has contributed historically, but healthy because you know that your culture is also indebted to others. Transdisciplinarity, so that our education systems move away from a segregated format that segregates knowledge and fractures knowledge in small pieces of disciplines that do not communicate with each other, towards a model where our education systems seek to address the complexity of the world. That is, dialogue across disciplines, but also most crucially, between academic knowledge and non-academic knowledge. That is, opening up our learning institutions so that they may become third spaces, if you will, or safe spaces, for a community where the school is, to convene, to question their society, to question their community, but most crucially for the school to become, through education, through social projects, for instance, education to become an actor of local development. Dialecticism, so that our youth can become co-creators, co-designers of their education systems, so that we move from a problem-solving education to a problem-posing one. And what this fundamentally means, in the age of AI, Idrisi, in the age of AI, I have heard a lot of preoccupations about the impact that it will have on learning. And one of my arguments, even though I do think we have to be very careful in the engagement with AI, look, if the measure of intelligence and the objective of our education system is only to measure how well someone answers a question, then yes, probably AI will be a profound crisis of our education systems. But what we have been defending at the OSCE before even the emergence of OpenAI and ChatGPT on a more global scale was to say, no, what we need is to support, build up the capacities of our youth to ask the right questions, to problematize a situation, including in their world. And this AI has proven in terms of relevance. AI can perhaps answer your questions far better than you can. But it cannot problematize the world, which requires, beyond just rational thinking, it requires context, emotional intelligence. And therefore you see this in ChatGPT and other generative AI platforms, that two people can be asking the same thing, that is this, but the prompt is different, they will get widely different results. Because one person has problematized the issue far better than the other. And therefore dialecticism seeks, through problem-posing pedagogy, to articulate the capacity of our youth, our students, to problematize. And that means also that you're preparing citizens that will be able to interpret their world, problematize situations of their society in order to resolve those problems. And finally, contextuality, that is adapting, of course, to the imperatives of the 21st century, but also, crucially, adapting to national priorities, to local realities, and to the individuality of students. the one-size-fits-all model is a source of exclusion and does not achieve our aspirations. So this is how I conceive of BIE very succinctly, as a means, to answer your question, of building those more peaceful societies that are also more just societies to which we aspire. I see another question from Hernán on YouTube, who says, hola, saludos desde México, ¿cómo se puede evitar la inmensa influencia que los países del norte tienen sobre el sur y que nos mantienen en sus lógicas de poder? ¿Qué opina de que siempre nuestros pueblos están mirando hacia el norte? Very well. So the question in English, to translate very briefly in English, is, greetings from Mexico. How can we avoid the influence that countries of the north have on the south and that keep us in their logic of power or their dynamics of power? What is your opinion that our people, on the fact that our peoples look towards the north? I will answer briefly in Spanish, then translate it into English. Primero y ante todo, Hernán, un saludo a usted, un saludo a usted desde Addis Abeba, desde Etiopía, desde la sede de la Organización de Cooperación del Sur, y un saludo particular a México, México que ha tenido un papel protagónico en el proceso que llevó a la creación de la Organización de Cooperación del Sur, aunque México todavía aún no es Estado miembro, ha tenido un papel protagónico en ese proceso a recibir la segunda cumbre en 2018 que llamó a una declaración universal. Su pregunta es una pregunta valiosa. Tengo que presentarle mis disculpas por un español mío que sigue siendo más o menos aproximado, pero lo que sí tengo que decirle antes de contestarle en la sustancia de su pregunta es, estimado Hernán, el hecho que no nos sentimos, no nos arraigamos dentro de un marco en contra del norte. Yo le voy a decir de forma muy sincera, he sido influenciado yo también por autores, pensadores, amigos en el norte. También he visto buenas prácticas en el norte que pueden ser de utilidad para nuestras sociedades. Así que no hay que rechazar la influencia del todo del norte. Hay que reconocer que hay que tomar lo bueno donde sea que se encuentre. En el norte, en el sur, el oeste, el este. Arriba, abajo. Pero, donde sí usted tiene toda la razón, es que no puede ser que seguimos siendo países que toman todo del norte. Y lo que estamos diciendo desde la Organización de Cooperación del Sur es que hay que ir y entrar en una dinámica que es la del desarrollo endógeno, el desarrollo con nuestras propias capacidades, el desarrollo con la contextualidad requerida para darle respuesta a las aspiraciones de nuestro pueblo, que de hecho no es exactamente la misma en cada país y seguramente no es exactamente la misma en el norte como en el sur. Pero usted me pregunta más bien sobre aspectos más concretos. No estamos aquí para reiterar ni ratificar lo que ya se sabe. Y nosotros, desde la Organización de Cooperación del Sur, creemos que primero hay una necesidad de desarrollar epistemologías del sur, desarrollar nuevo paradigma para nuestros países del sur, para tener nuevo paradigma, nuevas epistemologías que nos permitan desarrollar modelos propios, desarrollar una tercera vía de desarrollo. Y eso pasa, por supuesto, a través del cuestionamiento de los sistemas educativos que hemos heredado, pero también pasa por lo que nosotros estamos haciendo ahora, que es la convocatoria del Congreso del Gran Sur, donde tenemos que invitar a nuestros intelectuales, invitar a nuestros artistas, invitar a nuestra sociedad civil, invitar a nuestros pueblos, las comunidades indígenas, etcétera, invitarlos todos a contribuir sus recomendaciones para la articulación de un nuevo marco. Del otro lado de la ecuación, hay también el hecho de que necesitábamos, y por fin tenemos, a través de la Organización de Cooperación del Sur, una plataforma que pertenece a los estados, con una secretaría permanente ejecutiva para ejecutar las decisiones, pero también para visibilizar las buenas prácticas, visibilizar las iniciativas, facilitar el diálogo entre nuestros países. Eso es el segundo aspecto. Y el último es que tenemos, porque le hago una respuesta para las dos preguntas, necesitamos también, y eso es imprescindible, construir puentes entre nuestros países y pueblos. Si nuestros pueblos miran hacia el norte es porque es lo único que se puede ver. O sea, es muy difícil en México, como es difícil en Arabia, como es difícil en el sureste asiático, ¿no?, de ver películas, por ejemplo, que no sean películas que vienen del norte. Es muy difícil encontrar libros y publicaciones y poemas escritos en otras partes del sur. Es difícil para los políticos de ver iniciativas de forma sencilla, fácil, que existen en otras partes del sur. Es difícil para nuestros pueblos, porque también esos intercambios, esa capacidad de ver al otro, pasa también por el encuentro humano cara a cara. Y entonces es difícil para los latinoamericanos viajar a África y conocer a los africanos, y a los africanos a viajar al sureste asiático, y el sureste asiático viajar a América Latina y el Caribe, etc. Y entonces hay que construir esos puentes, y eso pasa por tres ejes principales, pero la verdad es que su pregunta es toda la acción de la Organización de Cooperación del Sur, es todo el espíritu de la tercera vía, así que eso tomaría muchísimo tiempo. Pero lo que sí le puedo decir es que son tres ejes principales. El primer eje es invertir en la infraestructura necesaria para conectar a nuestro pueblo, conectar a nuestros países. Y usted me dirá, pero ¿por qué hablar de esto? Por una razón sencilla. Si quiero viajar, bueno, le cuento que estaba en Sudamérica, en Surinam, y tenía que viajar a Kenia. La forma la más sencilla que tenía yo de viajar del sur al sur, del gran sur al gran sur, fue de viajar a Ámsterdam para volver, o sea, viajar al norte, o sea, ni siquiera en la buena dirección, para volver a África, volver al sur, lo que me hubiera tomado 11 horas, 12 horas, 13, vaya amigo Kulsi, 13 horas, me tomó 27. Usted se da cuenta de esto. Así que no podemos tener la expectativa de una cooperación sur-sur, que sea entre gobiernos, que sea entre pueblos, que sea de viajes y intercambios humanos, si es demasiado costoso de tener esa cooperación, en términos financieros, en términos de tiempo. Entonces hay que invertir en la infraestructura que conecta mejor las regiones dentro sí, pero también conectar las regiones entre ellas, las regiones que son parte del Gran Sur. El segundo eje es construir los puentes entre nuestros jóvenes. Y eso pasa, el intercambio humano. Porque los acuerdos entre gobiernos son indispensables. Fíjese, indispensables. Pero, al mismo tiempo, hay que reconocer que también la política cambia, los acuerdos comerciales cambian con el tiempo. Pero lo que sí dura, lo que sí es sostenible, son los puentes entre nuestros pueblos. Y pienso entonces al marco Freire, que es un marco que estamos lanzando desde la organización, para intercambios estudiantil y académico entre nuestros países. Porque cuando un joven de Camboya, un joven de Tailandia, va a estudiar en México, ya se construye un puente duradero, sostenible, entre México y Tailandia y Camboya, que durará, sobrevivirá cualquier cambio geopolítico. Y también las ideas nacen desde ahí. Las perspectivas cambian desde ahí también, en el contacto humano. El tercero es que tenemos que ir nutriendo, fortaleciendo nuestras industrias creativas en el sur. Y hacerlo, y al hacerlo, me parece indispensable mencionar que también crear los mercados, para decirlo así, que permitan a películas mexicanas de ser vistas en Etiopía, a películas etíopes de ser vistas en Tailandia, a escuchar música de otras regiones del mundo, tener intercambios o colaboraciones entre los artistas de nuestros países, porque eso también genera una expectativa de mirar hacia el otro, hacia el sur. Y termino también diciendo que una perspectiva esencial, porque hay que reconocer las equivocaciones de uno. Si uno no aprende de sus propias equivocaciones, si uno no aprende del pasado, uno no puede quejarse del presente ni tener grandes expectativas para el futuro. Y uno de los errores que hemos hecho como países, como pueblos en el pasado, hay que decirlo, todos los esfuerzos que habíamos intentado para fortalecer la integración, que sea regional o que sea sur-sur, fue, a mi juicio, demasiado ideologizada desde el principio. Y usted tiene que, yo creo que hay que hacer una distinción, para explicarme, entre pueblo y población. Si queremos integración dentro de nuestros pueblos, necesitamos generar un pueblo. Y para generar un pueblo, o sea, un sentimiento de pertenencia al sur, tal como hay un sentimiento de pertenencia a México, un sentimiento de pertenencia a América Latina y a la humanidad, hay que entender que para generar un pueblo se necesita tiempo. Y lo que hemos hecho es que en general hemos articulado herramientas de cooperación que en general fueron demasiado ideologizadas, y lo que pasa es que cuando un gobierno cambia y no comparte la ideología del gobierno anterior, se retira de la herramienta y se acabó la integración. Y entonces tenemos que tener ese cuidado, y creo que eso es la dinámica en la cual estamos desde la Organización de Cooperación del Sur, no politizarnos en el sentido ideológico y reconocer la necesidad para nuestros países, para nuestros pueblos, de herramientas que sí tienen un objetivo, un propósito, la construcción de una tercera vía desde y por el sur para la humanidad, pero que también reconozca que en el sur somos también diversos, y que el asunto de si somos de izquierda, de derecha, de centro, etc., esos son asuntos esenciales, pero a nivel nacional, a nivel de cada país. Pero a nivel del multilateralismo, de la cooperación sur-sur, tenemos que encontrarnos con todas nuestras diferencias, porque sí compartimos de forma muy pragmática desafíos y aspiraciones. Espero que le he contestado. Por favor, dígame usted si no le he contestado. I know that I've said I was going to summarize in English, but I know that I've spoken for a long time, and I'm being told that we're running out of time, so I'm just going to go. I apologize for everyone. I'm going to look at the other questions so that I can still answer as many questions as possible, if, of course, Mrs. Pearl authorizes me. So I see that we have a question from Joseph from Ethiopia, where he says, my question is, we people of the Greater South have the righteous anger within us towards injustice and unfairness of this world. However, we are not yet fully able to put this into action as fast as we would like to see it happen. How do we accelerate this action to see the future we want sooner? What is needed? That is a profound question, my dear Joseph. And again, and let me just go back to Spanish for one moment, because this is applicable as much to your question, Joseph, as to the question of Hernan. And that is, what I've said is general frameworks, but there is no recipe. We need to work together collectively to articulate those solutions. And therefore I remember the poem by Antonio Machado that I've quoted, I think, at every single one of those episodes that we have organized, which is, Caminante son tus huellas el camino y nada más. Caminante no hay camino, se hace camino al andar. Al andar se hace camino y al volver la vista atrás se ve la senda que nunca se ha de volver a pisar. Which means, wanderer, walker, your footsteps are the road and nothing else. Wanderer, walker. There is no road. The road is made by walking. And I'll skip the rest for the sake of time. So there is no easy solution. But I would argue that there's three principal reasons. Because it is true. It is true, and let us not kid ourselves. I could stand here and tell you, no, you see, you think, no. No. We have to assess the world as it is, if we want to change it. And that means we have to recognize it is true. I mean, climate change, we've known about it for decades. But it's true that we haven't made the progress we should have made to transform our development models. The issue of poverty, the issue of illiteracy, these are issues we have all been aware of for decades, and we have still not achieved our objectives, our noble aspirations. And the question is indeed why? And I would argue that the reason why, as you rightfully identified righteous anger as part of what we have in the South. But don't forget, there's two other things: love and collective action. Righteous anger alone is fruitless. That being said, I think there's three principles. But our societies seem, despite discourse, to be more amenable, to find it easier to conceive the end of the world, to conceive the extinction of humanity, say for a climate catastrophe, than to conceive the end of the systems that have led the world to the brink of unmaking itself. And I think this can be explained by three reasons that we have to address. I'm being told by Mrs. Pell that it is time. But do you know, we are in the South, and in the South, we have a different conception of time. So you will give me 15 more minutes. So, the three reasons is first, we have, whereas in the past, and this is, I'm paraphrasing Régis Debray, whereas in the past we have known the internationals of hope. Come, comrades, let's build the egalitarian society. Come, comrades, let us unite our region. Today, we have abandoned, of course, the internationals of hope. But we have discovered another international, and that is the international of anxiety. And of course, fear of the climate catastrophe is entirely legitimate. Perhaps even necessary. But fear alone, apologies, is never fruitful. Because in the best case scenario, it is entirely reactive. What can we do to avoid the catastrophe? Reacting to events. And in the worst case scenario, it's entirely paralyzing. If the world is coming to an end, why even bother? And therefore we must, number one, for this, renew with, and again it will sound fluffy, but trust me, if it is fluffy, then fluffy we must be. And that is renewing with dreams, with collective dreams. Not just what do we want to avoid, but where do we want to be as societies? Where is the dream that transcends me as a person, transcends every single one of us, and that will guide our action? We must be flexible in terms of action, but never lose sight of the dream that transcends us and unites us. And we must do this. That is, yes, I am in favor of the eradication, of course I am, nobody is against it, the eradication of poverty. But I am sorry to say that is not my dream. My dream is to build societies of shared prosperity. And one condition for that is the eradication of poverty. A dream is never negative, it's always positive. And it goes beyond the bare minimum. The second reason, I would argue, is that we cannot conceive the end of a status quo without having thought about its replacement. That is, there can be no deconstruction of unjust power dynamics without the plans for the reconstruction. And therefore what we need with this is to articulate also tangible action programs for our collectives, for our countries. And part of what we are doing here, Joseph, at the OSC, but crucially on those sessions, is engaging together to identify how best we can achieve our aspirations through the articulation of tangible, palpable, common action plans. It is not enough to feel righteous anger. It is not enough to be a collective, and it is not enough to have a dream fueled by love. These are crucial. But we must also, whilst always having our heads in the skies and the clouds, always have our feet on the ground. And that means looking very pragmatically on what it is we want to achieve and how we can achieve it, when to achieve it, realistically. Concrete plans of transformation that again need to be positive. They can't just be against certain things. And finally, the third point is collective action. Because we have been so enveloped in the individualism of our education systems, of our development models, of our economic models, that we have forgotten what collective action means. And collective action, my dear Joseph, is not many people doing the same thing at the same time. That is, in economic terms, as I've said in the past, the definition of a crisis. If tomorrow every single one of us, so many people, go to the supermarket at the same time to buy toilet paper, we have a crisis on our hands. That is not collective action. Collective action is a coordinated, multi-pronged, multi-front, decided struggle for a common objective, with a consciousness of a community of destiny. That is, many people doing different things at different times to achieve the same aspiration. And therefore we must renew with collective action. So how can we accelerate this further? I would say, addressing these 3 points that I raised, but also and most crucially, I would say, for you to be involved, you must all be proactive contributors. A third way of development, a better world, again, does not emanate from a single person or a single organization. It is our joint collective construction. There is no recipes. only elements for me to provide, and actions that we have mentioned as well. Then, let us see . Okay, I see that we have one last question, which is a very long one. So it's from WhatsApp, so I don't think we can actually show it, but I'll read it and... Thank you. So I have read, I apologize, it was a very, very long message, so I will not be reading entirely, but to summarize that message, because I did say that these sessions are without filters. So we received a message from, I don't actually have the name, but I think I have an idea, that apparently someone had applied to join the organization, I think last year, and did not have a pleasant experience in the recruitment process, and that had complained about it, and that had received a response to the effect that we were sorry about it, and that we would take appropriate action. And therefore, the question is, well, it's not really a question. She would like me to address it because there has been no follow-up since. So first and foremost, allow me to thank you for reaching out. One always welcomes reaching out, and I do believe it was brought to my attention not so long ago about this particular case. I do understand, for the sake of clarity to everyone, this was an interview process that happened virtually, and I do understand that, because I did see such a report, that across a few interview requests they were postponed to last minute, and that you were also, I think in one case, made to wait 10 or so minutes online without news about the postponement of the interview, for which I must say, first and foremost, that I am most sorry. This is not standard practice at the Organization of Southern Cooperation or in our hiring process. But unfortunately, this has happened. I also understand that in the interview, which was a virtual interview again, and as happens in OSC interviews, this was a panel of interviewers, that you felt that one of the interviewers was not being fair in their questions to you and in their attitude, which again, we apologize that was how you felt about this situation. I do believe that this was brought some months ago, almost a year ago, to our attention, and that we did send apologies for what had happened, and that appropriate action would be taken. I understand also that you had responded to thank us for that response. Now, your question is more as to why there has been no follow-up after that. And this is where I will focus. As you will appreciate, the concerns that you raised were concerns that needed to be addressed by the organization, even though it is not standard practice. Any small mistake that might happen in the process must be looked at and rectified. And as part of this, we have made clearer guidelines within our human resources department, section within the Department of Administration, to both, on the one hand, ensure that these processes are clearer with clear timeframes and timelines in mind, to ensure that such delays or postponements that are very last minute do not occur again. On the other end of the spectrum, regarding your feeling with regards to one of the panel members who interviewed you, we have looked into it, as you can appreciate. Just as you have your privacy, staff members also have privacy, unless, of course, it is such serious cases as harassments of things of the sort, which is not this case now, and I understand was only about the attitude of the questions being asked. However, what we have done to overcome this, or to make sure this does not happen again, because we want all the interviewees to feel at ease within the process, is we also issued and developed clearer guidelines in terms of how you should interview people. So with clearer questions to be asked and clearer training to be asked. So I think that overall, this is my answer to you. That is, as you can appreciate, we are sorry that this has happened to you. Of course, this was brought to my attention months after it happened. But as soon as a report was filed, I think it was sent eventually to my desk. We have apologized, and we do apologize that that was your experience. We hope that this will not stop you from considering the OSC in the future. However, I can assure you, as I have said, in addition to the apologies, that the necessary measures have been taken to ensure that your concerns during this virtual interview process do not reoccur, in particular with regards to punctuality of informing when the interview happens, or any postponement thereof that often happens, of course, inevitable. But due notice is always important, and also that we issued new procedures and guidelines to ensure that these issues do not replicate. I hope I have addressed your concern, and if not, you can as well always reach out. Let me see. Do we have any other questions? I don't see any. Very well, very well. In this case, allow me to conclude this episode 3 by thanking all of you that have joined us during this important session that allowed us to delve a bit deeper in certain aspects of our endeavors from the OSC, but most importantly, to articulate collectively, jointly, this third way of development from and by the Greater South for humanity to which we aspire. And of course, as I've said last time, the road will be long. The journey will be arduous, but with unwavering perseverance, unwavering determination, the river forges the rock. And in this regard, to conclude, remember, love, righteous anger, collective action for a better tomorrow.